This is the Smart Buildings Academy podcast with Phil Zito, episode 372. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 372 of the Smart Buildings Academy podcast. In this episode, we are going to be talking about wireless fundamentals for building automation professionals. So in this episode, we're going to be covering what wireless is. We're going to talk about the different layers of wireless, different wireless technologies. We're going to talk about deploying wireless, and that'll involve selecting the right wireless system, designing the right wireless system, and deploying the right wireless system. So we're going to be going through all of that on today's episode. As always, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us and ask them via the chat. We're monitoring that live. And all resources mentioned today will be available at podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/372. Once again, that's podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/372. Now, before we dive in, I do want to mention we've had a lot of folks leave us good reviews on iTunes lately. Thank you so much for doing that. That really helps grow the show. If you found us valuable, please leave a 5-star review on iTunes. And if you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if you're watching this on LinkedIn, definitely like and share with folks. I do want to mention that if you're going through wireless fundamentals today and you find yourself lacking in some of the IT concepts, we do have an IT course that is used by several large OEMs and system integrators to train their folks. And I would encourage you to look into that course. All right, let's dive in to what wireless is. I'm going to sit up a little bit, feeling a little short here. All right, so wireless is essentially the transmission of electrons through the air. And this is accomplished from one point to another utilizing certain concepts. And I'm going to talk about these concepts. If you're not familiar with a sine wave, essentially that's what's going on here, right? We have this wave going up and down, and that wave oscillates between a positive and a negative. The frequency of which that wave is going up and down is called, surprisingly, frequency. The length of that wave is called wavelength. And the bandwidth, right, that is going to determine, right, how much data bits we can go and transfer. Now, as you increase frequency, the length of the wave decreases, and that means we're getting more ones and zeros, more positive sides of the wave and negative sides of the wave in the same amount of time. So the further along we go, the smaller the wave gets. So higher frequency equals smaller wavelength, which equals increased bandwidth and data transmission capacity. Why do I tell you all this? Because as we start to get into Wi-Fi, cellular, mesh, and Bluetooth, we're going to want to understand these concepts. Now, a good way to illustrate this is the frequency at which a human voice communicates is fairly low, but the frequency at which a neutron star goes and blasts light out is pretty high. So if we were able to encode data into a neutron blast, we would have a ton of data because it's oscillating crazy fast. The wavelength is super small and the frequency is super large. So you've got a lot of electrons, a lot of energy. That's what makes X-rays and neutron blasts so dangerous. Now, where we live in the frequency span is typically in the 2.4 to 5 gigahertz range. Not really anything very dangerous, but it does also have some negatives, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about sizing our systems. But before we get there, with frequency and wavelength and bandwidth hopefully pretty well described, let's move into what I call the wireless spheres. And the wireless spheres are wide area network. So we're talking city blocks to countries, local area networks, and personal area networks. Within the wide area network space, we have pretty much cellular. There used to be some talk about WiMAX and widespread Wi-Fi and things like that, but it's pretty much regulated itself down to cellular, especially with 5G. We're able to do crazy fast transmission speeds because of the frequency associated with that. Now, when it comes to local area networks, we are traditionally using Wi-Fi. That is our technology of choice in a local area network. That's, building floor level network. We also are seeing mesh, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit as well. And then finally, on the personal area network, which I used to be totally honest, I used to ignore PANs, personal area networks, but we are increasingly seeing sensors that are coming out with Bluetooth hotspots. So as you walk up with your phone, you can connect to that personal area network on that Bluetooth network, and you can actually commission sensors. I'm increasingly seeing this come out with manufacturers, and it's an area I expect to see continued advancement because we all know how freaking difficult it is. You're in the field, you're sitting there trying to figure out where's the box so I can plug in. And, this is a wall plate sensor, so it doesn't have a jack for me to plug in. And then I need to connect to the controller. Well, with these PAN networks, we'll be able to connect. Now, granted, that also introduces some security concerns, but we'll talk about that in a future episode. So what are the main wireless systems we are going to be interfacing with as a building automation professional? I'm going to go in order of what I see on a case-to-case basis. Do realize that what you see may be different than what I see, and my priority doesn't necessarily trump your priority. This is just my personal experience. So the first thing we're going to start off with is Wi-Fi. And there's a lot of different bands or frequencies of Wi-Fi, but I'm going to focus primarily on the 2.4 frequency and the 5.0 frequency. So 2.4 is primarily what we associate with Wi-Fi. So we're not talking the ISM 900 megahertz band. We're talking the 2.4 gigahertz band. That is primarily where I see most manufacturers utilizing their Wi-Fi systems. Now, how Wi-Fi works is you have a series of channels across this 2.4 gigahertz band, and these channels, they do have overlap, but basically within that channel, you're transmitting bits of data. And this wireless access point, we're not going to talk about ad hoc wireless networks. We're going to talk about traditional Wi-Fi access points and wireless LAN controllers. So we're going to go a little deep today, but I promise it won't be too terribly confusing. But what happens is we have these wireless access points. They send out, I forgot what it's called. I believe it's called a beacon. And that broadcast shares the SSID. And the SSID is essentially the ID of that wireless network. Now, what will happen is when a device is connected to an access point, and this is where things get a little wonky with Wi-Fi. When a device is connected to an access point, as it moves throughout the building, say it's your phone, it's your laptop, whatever, access points will hand off as you move from, one area to the next. Each access point typically has a series of channels, and you get handed off from one access point to the next, and that's done by the wireless LAN controller. So all access points typically are hardwired back to a switch that connects to a wireless LAN controller, and that manages your wireless networks, wireless handoff, etc. The thing with building automation, where things get a little different, is with building automation systems, our devices are not moving, or at least they should not be moving. When you put a wireless sensor on a wall, or you put a rooftop that's wireless, got a wireless communication card on the roof, that should never move, which gives us a lot of pros, but it also comes with some particular cons. For one, wireless access points are really substantially affected by line of sight. Unlike mesh systems, which have a coordinator and then they have a router, and these routers repeat from router to end device, wireless is not Wi-Fi, I should be careful. Wi-Fi is not self-healing. Wi-Fi tends to have a 20-meter line of sight. And remember that thing that I said earlier about frequency and wavelength and bandwidth? Well, with high frequency, X-rays, neutrino blasts, etc., those things can go right through everything except for like lead, right? And some of that stuff can even penetrate that. But Wi-Fi, it is not anywhere near as high frequency. So it has a much lower wavelength, has much less energy, and thus if it hits water, if it hits any glazing, so window glazing, if it hits any steel, you're going to have major refraction. Refraction is basically the signal bouncing back. And this needs to be accounted for because what is on the roof? Insulation, metal roofs, membranes, etc. So if you are expecting data to transfer through a roof, probably not going to happen. If you're putting stuff in a mechanical room that's solid concrete with a lot of EMF, a lot of electrical interference, you're probably going to have some issues. So we need to be cognizant of that when we're using Wi-Fi. It was one of the biggest issues I noticed when wireless sensors and controllers first rolled out was people just thought, it's line of sight, it's wireless. They didn't factor into account all the different ways in which these frequencies could be interfered with. And remember, we were primarily at 2.4. Now we're getting up to 5.0, which is a higher frequency, which allows for us to better resist interference. I'm just going to check real quick on sound, make sure we're doing good, and then I'm going to continue on to cellular. So let me just double check that. Okay, we sound beautiful. Good. All right, so that's Wi-Fi in a nutshell. We'll come back to it a little more. Cellular, 3G, 4G, 5G. Cellular is really cool in that it allows us to have some, what I call infrastructure less. So not one word, but actually two words. So less infrastructure, whereas Wi-Fi requires access points. It requires wireless LAN controllers, switches, and it is a hybrid, both hardwire as well as software. Cellular, it does require cell towers, and you can't go, just install a cell tower anywhere. But if you are in an area with decent cell coverage, it gives you a way, especially with 4G and 3G, to do data transfer, to do remote access that you wouldn't have in a situation where you potentially didn't have the infrastructure required. Because remember, mesh and Wi-Fi, both of these at some point are going to require a hardwired connection that you're going to provide. Whereas with cellular, you're just connecting to the cell tower. So you're going to have a cellular modem that's going to connect to the cell tower, and that cellular modem will connect maybe directly to your device or maybe to something like a Linksys switch, etc. So that's cellular. There definitely is a higher cost associated with cellular, so do be cognizant of that. Mesh. Let's talk about mesh. For mesh, we're going to primarily focus in on Zigbee. And let's talk through that. So Zigbee is a self-healing mesh network. So it's like a honeycomb network where devices connect to devices. And so if you lose a router, that router will then, so basically how it works, right? You have a coordinator. That coordinator hardwires into the network. The coordinator connects to a series of routers, and these routers connect to end devices. End devices can connect to routers, but they cannot sit there and be a router, typically. Routers can be routers, right? And an end device can have routing capabilities. But coordinators are really the only thing that are going to connect back to the sole network. So with this, you have a 75 to 100 meters line of sight. It is significantly slower though, whereas Wi-Fi, in theory, Wi-Fi 6, which no manufacturer that I'm aware of is using yet, has a 9.6 gigabits limit, gigabits per second. And Wi-Fi 7 supposedly has a 40 gigabits per limit bandwidth, or speed rather. Oh my gosh, mixing up my words here. Do I ever foresee any situation in which you could need 40 gigabits for building automation traffic? No. But if you're doing a integrated system with video or some sort of massive data pools, then maybe you might need that higher bandwidth. But for building automation, you're typically good at a meg for most cases. So like I said, mesh has significantly less. We're talking 250 kilobits per second. So significant drop from gigabits to kilobits, massive drop, 1% of a percent. Now, what do we gain with mesh that we don't have with Wi-Fi? Wi-Fi is chatty. Wi-Fi is a higher frequency. Wi-Fi is a higher bandwidth. What does higher bandwidth and frequency require more of? Electricity. So this is why I told you about frequency, wavelength, and bandwidth, because the nice thing about Wi-Fi is you get a lot more electrons. And since you get more electrons, you get more bandwidth. With mesh, not so much. You don't really get as much bandwidth. But because you have less speed, you now have more battery life. So it's a trade-off. Do you want more battery life but less speed? And in most cases with building automation, 250 kilobits per second is fine, right? We were doing 9600 baud for a while on our field trunks. 250 kilobits is much higher than that. And then we move to Bluetooth, which is for our personal area networks. And Bluetooth, really what that's going to do is that's primarily like for direct configuration. And usually in my experience with Bluetooth, while it can be used for data feeds, traditionally it's used to initiate a session between a mesh or Wi-Fi connection, maybe an ad hoc Wi-Fi connection, which is just a direct wireless NIC, network interface card, to another wireless network interface card, avoiding the actual wireless access point. So what do you do with all this data? Like, what does any of this mean to you? Well, in order to use this, now you have an understanding of these four technologies. Now let's talk about actually deploying wireless in a building. First thing we want to do is identify our use case. Like, why are we using wireless? So if we're using wireless on an existing building and we want to go and reduce infrastructure costs, that's one thing. If we're doing it on a new build to reduce infrastructure costs, that's another one. If we want to utilize the existing wireless system and framework that's in place from the building owner, that's another use case. And once we understand why we're using this, some folks want to use wireless cellular connections for remote meter reading. Other folks want to use cellular connections for remote access to buildings that are isolated. Other folks want to take a historic building, utilize its Wi-Fi network to connect controllers and sensors without having to potentially deface the walls and things like that by running wire and conduit. So identify that use case. Once you know the use case, you can then go and identify the cost and funding structure. So certain things are going to have certain costs. Wireless is going, in the case of cellular, going to have a bandwidth cost. You're going to typically pay for the modem, you're going to pay a monthly service fee, and then you're going to pay bandwidth. Where I said cellular, right? Cellular is what's going to happen. Wi-Fi, though, is typically existing infrastructure, and you're just going to utilize the Wi-Fi infrastructure. But depending on how they set up the access points in the SSIDs, you may be sharing a public network with your building automation network. So just be cognizant of that. That goes back to our previous discussion on quality of service and how if you have video or streaming or anything that has a quality of service tag associated with it, building automation data typically doesn't have a quality of service tag. So when networks get congested, the tagged data will survive and the untagged data tends to get rejected. This will cause issues with your building automation data, especially on a wireless system. There is bit error rate. There is things like eavesdropping. There is things like signal jamming, etc. We're not really going to cover that. There are more advanced wireless topics, but those are things to legitimately consider in critical facilities. A 4 to 20 milliamp hardwired sensor is not going to be as susceptible to bit error rate like you would have in a Wi-Fi, where potentially signal gets corrupted and you have to do resends, or potential jamming, where a Wi-Fi signal actually gets jammed or gets a man-in-the-middle attack. So these are things that you potentially will not have to deal with a wired infrastructure. So identify the use case. Is security important? What level of security is redundancy, constant uptime, etc. Based on this, right, we then identify, like I said, our cost funding structure. And like I said, Wi-Fi, if we can utilize the existing Wi-Fi infrastructure, that's really going to help us out. If we can't utilize the existing Wi-Fi infrastructure, and we have to use something like the cellular infrastructure, then we do have to be cognizant of that from a cost perspective. Mesh is something that is going to have a much greater cost. So where cellular is a small capital cost for the cellular modem, but a longer operational cost. So you're starting to see Wi-Fi, not really a cost typically, unless IT is charging you to use their Wi-Fi network. Cellular is an upfront cost, small, with a lifetime operational cost. Mesh is a higher capital cost because typically no one has a mesh network lying around. So you have to install all of these routers, you have to install the coordinator, and you have to install the host devices. So the routers will typically be a Zigbee router that attaches to a controller. The end device is connected physically to that router flag that will hang off of it, and that router will go from router to router, bouncing until it hits the coordinator. And so those are some costs you have to account for. Now that you know that, you can select the appropriate technology. In a case where there are a lot of concrete and steel walls, and you don't want to try to run wire, you want to go wireless, but Wi-Fi is not really practical. In that case, a mesh architecture may make sense. In the case of a remote building out in the middle of a field, it may make sense to do cellular. Now, I did not cover microwave. I did not cover directed signaling, but that also is something, line of sight microwave signaling from antenna to antenna, from a centralized facility back to maybe a barn or chilled water plant that's sitting somewhere out in a field. So just be cognizant that that exists, even if I didn't cover it. Once you've selected this technology, though, now you have to lay it out. In the case of Wi-Fi, you often have little influence, if any, on where access points get placed. So what you can ask for, however, is a survey. And what happens with Wi-Fi, and I'll see if I can share this Wi-Fi survey map. It may allow me to share it. Let's see. Okay, it's not wanting to let me share it, is it? No. Okay. All right. So as we get to a higher negative dB, and this is how Wi-Fi is measured, the lower the negative dB, the stronger the signal. The higher the negative dB, the lower the signal. So as you increase your negative decibels, you have a less strong signal. So what you're going to want to ask for is a signal strength map with Wi-Fi, and you're going to want to see your coverage. Now here's the challenge. On a new build, these Wi-Fi maps are almost never laid out prior to construction. And if they are laid out prior to construction, they often will change as the building is constructed. So you need to be cognizant that if you're not near a access point, you could have issues, especially if you're putting something in a mechanical room or something like that. So laying out the technology with Wi-Fi is very much coordinating with IT and being cognizant of the spaces in which your devices and or sensors are going. Cellular laying out the technology typically is super simple. You do a cellular strength test. You can go and do that using a cellular scanner or by simply going on Google and searching for cellular strength maps and figuring out which provider covers which area. If it is a critical facility, you definitely have to look at uptime guarantees with cellular because you are at the mercy of the cellular provider. But really laying out the technologies as much as finding the cellular modem and then figuring out how do you take the IP internet protocol connection from that cellular modem and route it to your associated devices throughout the building. Mesh is super duper simple, probably the simplest, as long as you keep in mind that you have a 75 to 100 meters line of sight, take into account interference, and you just use a basic drafting pencil. You can draw your little circles if your drawings are to scale, and you can figure out where do we need to put coordinators and where will we have gaps. And then you can plug coordinators, or sorry, not coordinators, routers into the appropriate spots. And that's pretty simple. Bluetooth, I haven't mentioned it much through this because it's usually embedded in the devices and it's a couple feet. So we are not typically dealing with anything that we have to design for Bluetooth. So once you've laid that out, it's as simple as installing. And this is where you just follow basic installation practices. For Wi-Fi, you just want to make sure that there's a wireless NIC on the devices that need to connect to the access point and that they can connect to the access point. One thing you want to be cognizant of is what happens if that access point changes. Do they flush leases on IP addresses associated with Wi-Fi? Because unlike most things, you typically don't have a static IP with Wi-Fi. You can, but you don't typically. And so you need to be aware of if they flush your IP lease. What does that mean? With cellular, pretty straightforward. You just simply install the cellular modem and call it a day. And then with mesh, once again, also pretty straightforward. You just install the mesh flags according to where you laid things out. So there you have it in a nutshell. That is wireless fundamentals for building automation professionals. That covers the 4 main wireless technologies, how to deploy them, what they are, and some of the terminology around wireless. Let's see what questions you have, and I will answer those. Thanks so much for watching so far, folks. I hope that this has been really beneficial to you. As always, podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/372. Once again, that's podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/372. I will go and answer any of the questions you have related to wireless. So let's see what you got. I'll wait here just a second to see what, if any, questions come in. So, alrighty. Let's see if anything. Let's check over here. And let's check there. Okay, not seeing anything coming in. So far, that makes my life pretty easy. And gives me an early Friday. Definitely. All right. So as I said, everything will be available podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/372. Definitely go and look there. It'll be available in about an hour. So let's go from that. Is 5G hazardous to health at all? I'm not an expert, Jacob, so I can't answer that. I can tell you, based on what I know of Wi-Fi, 5G is now. I assume you're talking about cellular 5G, not 5 megahertz Wi-Fi. Let me see where 5G operates. 5G frequency. What's it operate at for frequency? So 5G is 2.4 gigs up to 554 gigs. Low band 5G uses similar frequency to 4G, that's 600 to 900 megahertz. Okay. So if we look at the frequency chart, let me look. Let's open this up. The EMF. Yes, I can see these, Andrew. So let's take a look at this chart. So 5G is somewhere between traditional cellular phones and microwave and satellite. It is non-ionizing radiation, which I want to preface this. I am not an expert on this, so just be cognizant of that. So please don't hate me. My understanding of non-ionizing radiation is that it is not going to cause cell disruption. So ionizing radiation will penetrate your skin and it will actually detach certain parts of the nucleus and your DNA, and it'll mess stuff up. And like in a bad enough case, like nuclear war with gamma radiation, you essentially, your cells basically dissolve inside you and you bleed to death. Non-ionizing radiation, not so much. So we see that it exists in the 5G range. It's on the very end of the microwave range. So it's before sunlight. And so if you're working out based on limited knowledge, in theory, if you're out in the sun, you're going to take a higher frequency radiation in the range of 430 to 750 terahertz over a longer period of time than you would at 30 gigahertz from cell signals. So I hope that made sense, Jacob. I hope that was clear. Let me see if that made sense. I got a lot of comments coming in right now, so that's awesome. Let's see. Was that way more information than you wanted to possibly know about wireless signals? While I wait for you to reply, let me take a look at everything else I see. What would you say to techs who say wireless never works? I would say what I say to everyone. If anyone says anything never works, this is kind of like what I tell my wife, right? We talk and, you know, sometimes I'll say always or never. Sometimes she'll say always or never. And in my opinion, there are very few arguments that you should take seriously if someone uses the term always or never. And that's myself included. So I try not to use those because if wireless never worked, then how do we have wireless systems throughout buildings? How do we even have a home automation network? Because that is riding largely on either mesh or Wi-Fi. So anytime a tech told me wireless would never work, I would say, what are you basing that on? What's your fact pattern? What's your proof? And if they said, well, I'd installed it here, I'd installed it here, I would say, did you look at a wireless survey map? Did you actually see where your DBM was? And based on that DBM, did you determine like, hey, there's going to be some channel issues? Did you understand the effect of glazing and metal refraction on wireless? I would take all those things into account. So that's how I would address that, Andrew. Hopefully that helps. Vladimir Paul says, is wireless can be used to connect to a VAV controller and the zone sensor thermostat, or can it be used as a COM wire? Okay, so wireless is not going to be, I don't want you to think of traditional field trunks with wireless, right? The closest thing with wireless that you could get to a traditional field trunk would be mesh, where you have routers. And so basically the router gets attached to the end device, typically through a COM port. So it's powered through the COM port and it's attached. And then that router goes to the next router and it hops in the shortest path. So it uses a pathing algorithm to get back to the coordinator, which connects to the network. Okay. So that is the closest you can get to a COM wire. But even then, those signals are not necessarily repeating. Those are going to get to basically the coordinator. Okay. Now, typically wireless is a point to point. So I would consider it a wireless star pattern. So if we remember star patterns from our wired conversations, wireless is typically the access point, right? Is going to go and send out its broadcast, and then you're going to subscribe to the access point. The access point's then going to route your wireless network your wireless network interface card information back to the wireless LAN controller. Your MAC address is then assigned an IP address, which is then broadcasted out. And that wireless LAN controller looks for your device as you move from access point channel to access point channel. That really doesn't matter to us because our devices don't move around. So wireless can definitely be used to connect to VAV controllers and to sensors. I will tell you in my experience, though, you typically will use wireless Wi-Fi to powered controllers, but for sensors, it's traditionally Bluetooth or mesh because those are typically battery powered or solar powered. All right. Would I ever use Wi-Fi in a campus setting? Yeah, quite often. Many manufacturers have really good Wi-Fi products, and using Wi-Fi definitely can be done, especially if you have a dedicated private subnet coming off of an access point for your devices. One of the folks says, check out the 5G videos on Rumble. I'm not even touching that with a 10-foot pole because I'll cause, like I said, I have no dog in the fight with 5G. I don't know enough to say anything about it other than I understand frequencies and I understand ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. And that's about it. I'm not a scientist. I will never profess to be. So I can't really tell you anyway on the effect. And that's a hot potato that I'm not going to touch. A quick comment regarding power consumption. Higher frequency wireless actually requires less power to transmit compared to lower frequencies with longer wavelengths. Perhaps higher power is required to actually process the higher bandwidths. Yes, thank you, Pat. You're absolutely correct about that. It is the electron density of the higher frequency that is higher, but not the initiating power. There's more electrons in there. The issue, to your point, with Wi-Fi and higher frequency systems like that is one, the transmission frequency. So how many times does it go and create a connection? So I did simplify that, Pat, and thank you for pointing that out. But basically, the big thing with mesh is it sleeps and then it transmits as needed, whereas Wi-Fi is always typically on and it's not meant to be battery powered typically. So it is going and transmitting constantly typically. And that processing as well as that constant transmitting tends to degrade power faster. So thank you for pointing that out. Are direct digital control boxes, Jacob asks, are direct digital control boxes input-output interfaces wireless too, or should those always be wired? I don't ever want to answer with always. So I'm going to challenge you to try to eliminate always and never from your vocabulary. There are situations in which if you have a imaging room with an MRI machine, you probably don't want a wireless temperature sensor in there. Probably would not be a good idea. A lot of EMF that comes off of that. It's kind of like if you put a sensor right above a microwave, you could get some issues. Whereas I would say that there are situations where you've got a giant open auditorium. It would make great sense to put a wireless sensor in there because you've got perfect line of sight, you've got very little interference, and it would make a lot of sense. So it all comes back to what I said earlier, which is look at that use case, and based on that use case, then go from there and make your decision. So great questions, folks. Really appreciate all of them. Let's see if there's anything else from anyone that I could potentially answer. But, so far, your questions are great. I appreciate your engagement and definitely love answering these topics. So I'll give a couple seconds because I do realize there's like a 30-second latency on the live stream. So you're hearing me 30 seconds after I speak. So, alrighty. See if we got any other questions coming in. Okay. On a high level, please describe wireless building management systems for typical HVAC systems. Okay. So you got to like how high? Like server high. So you have a server that typically sits on an IP backbone, goes to the supervisory devices. The supervisory devices, they can have wireless network interface cards, traditionally Wi-Fi. I haven't run into a lot of supervisory devices with mesh. So traditionally Wi-Fi, and from Wi-Fi, then you access the greater network, which then enables you to access traditionally your controllers via Wi-Fi. And then your mesh will traditionally, it'll either be mesh or Bluetooth, something line of sight from the controller to the IO. But traditionally, in my experience, IO, so inputs and outputs, are going to be hardwired traditionally. We are seeing an increase of non-hardwired IO, especially in the temperature sensor space. So you're seeing that, but that's the traditional architecture. Now there is manufacturers that use wireless like Zigbee or Z-Wave, N-Ocean, stuff like that. It follows the same pattern of the supervisory device would traditionally be the coordinator, or it would have a router attached to it. When I say router, don't think IP router. A router in the case of mesh is traditionally just a flag that hangs off of it and transmits. But that then would connect to other flags, other routers, and it would just create this essentially spider web of communication. Hopefully that helps. There you go. Great questions today, folks. I love it. I wonder what we got coming down the pipe. Let's take a look. I believe we have Mondays already mapped out. I just haven't put it up yet. So let's take a look. Let's go to marketing. Let's go to podcasts. Mondays is going to be selling planned service agreements. So we're going to dive into selling planned service agreements. That actually came from one of our salespeople, Tony, who suggested that I talk about that topic. So we'll be talking about that on Monday. Anything else we should talk about, do not hesitate to let us know. Like I said, about an hour from now at podcast.smartbuildingsacademy.com/372, this whole thing will be up there with any supporting documents and information. Any last minute questions I can answer? Thank you, Andrew. I'm glad you enjoyed this. Thank you, Jacob. Glad you enjoyed this as well. If you haven't yet, please like, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, go and leave us a 5-star review if you think we earned it on iTunes, and share this with your coworkers. If you found our form of teaching here wonderful and informative, I will tell you our paid courses are even better. So I'd encourage you to check those out at courses.smartbuildingsacademy.com. If you've got any end of year funds left, I encourage you to use those to train your team. Alrighty. I think that is it for now. Thank you so much, everybody. Not seeing anything more coming in, so we will call it for today. And I hope you all have an awesome weekend. I got a Boy Scout camping trip coming up. We're going into the mountains and hiking and cooking and doing sort of Boy Scout stuff. So should be pretty fun with my son. And I will see you all on Monday. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much for being here.